Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for taking the time to join us as we continue our 2024 webinar series. My name is Tina Barr, and I'm the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. NACOLE is an organization that works to create a community of support for independent civilian oversight entities seeking to hold their local law enforcement agencies, jails, and prisons more accountable, transparent, and responsive to the communities they serve. One part of that effort is our webinar series. Since 2015, NACOLE has worked to bring information through our webinars on effective practices in civilian oversight, innovations in the field, and efforts to reform the criminal legal system. Before we begin today, I'd like to go over a few logistics. Given the expected number of audience members today, everyone has entered the webinar in listen-only mode. However, the Q&A feature is on, and you can post your questions in there at any time. To ensure that our speaker for today is able to get through the prepared presentation, though, the responses to the questions will occur at the end of the formal presentation. However, if there is a question asking for clarification about something the speaker is addressing in the moment, and it would be helpful to get clarification on that, then I will bring that to his attention as soon as I'm able to. You will have the ability to upvote questions so that some of the questions can be moved higher up in the queue of questions. That way, that will help us address some of the more pressing questions in the short amount of time that we have today. Finally, as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to those of you who registered for 3 months. By the end of this week, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to access the recording, as well as a copy of the modified slide deck used today. Now that the logistics are out of the way, I would like to turn our attention to the webinar for the day. The title is Using Data and Collaboration to Drive Innovative Change. Today's webinar addresses how some communities are using data-informed measures not typically thought of as police accountability that are demonstrably improving outcomes. Today's speaker, Mr. Jared Fishman, is the founder and executive director of Justice Innovation Lab, an organization that works with communities to design data-informed solutions for a more fair and effective justice system. Prior to founding Justice Innovation Lab, Mr. Fishman served for 14 years as a senior civil rights prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he led some of the most complex civil rights prosecutions in the country, securing convictions in high-profile cases involving police misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. He received multiple awards from the DOJ for distinguished service, including the Civil Rights Division's highest award for excellence in legal advocacy. Mr. Fishman is the author of Fire on the Levee, the story of his struggle to unravel the cover-up of a police shooting and subsequent incineration of the shooting victim in Hurricane Katrina-era New Orleans. Mr. Fishman began his career at the U.S. Department of State, where he worked to rebuild legal systems in post-war Kosovo, and he also served as a line prosecutor at the Washington, D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, handling domestic violence and sex offense cases. Mr. Fishman regularly speaks on issues of data-driven criminal justice reform, police accountability, hate crimes, and human trafficking. Mr. Fishman serves as adjunct faculty at Georgetown University and at the George Washington University Law School. He is also the lead singer and rhythm guitarist of a middle-aged dad garage band. Okay, I am going to turn things over to our speaker, Jared Fishman, and I will go off camera.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming today to this webinar. As Tina told you at the top of the hour, it's officially called Data and Collaboration to Drive Innovative Change. But really what I want to talk about today is what'll it take to fix the world. I think the group of people who have gathered here today are my people of sorts, people who believe it's necessary to hold those in power accountable, and that includes law enforcement when they violate the public trust. I spent much of my career investigating police misconduct when I was at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And in 2018, I was standing on the courthouse steps in Charleston, South Carolina, after what was arguably the biggest victory of my career. A police officer named Michael Slager from the North Charleston Police Department had been found guilty of depriving Walter Scott of his constitutional rights. The judge found that the killing was a murder and sentenced Michael Slager to 20 years incarceration, one of the longest sentences ever given to a police officer for killing a civilian. And even though it was the biggest victory of my career, as I stood on the courtroom steps that day, I felt empty inside. I felt empty in part because I knew that in the 2.5 years it had taken us to investigate that murder, over 2,500 other people had died in confrontations with the police. I knew that no matter what we did or accomplished, that Walter would never come back. And even more to the point, I knew that the next day, the policies, procedures, systems that had contributed to to Walter Scott's death would still be in place. And when you have those sort of feelings after your biggest victory, you know it's time to look for a new job. Even though the newspapers were declaring it a monumental day for civil rights, I knew there was more that we could do to begin to fix the system. So over the next year or so, I struggled to figure out where could I contribute to try to fix the broken justice system around us. And one day I got a phone call from my partner down in South Carolina. She was the chief prosecutor for Charleston County, and she'd been collecting data on a lot of the decisions that she had made, that her office of 60 prosecutors make about what to do with cases once they come into the system, who to prosecute, how to resolve cases, and what to happen with them. And she said to me, do you think we can use this information to answer the question, are we being fair? And to me, this was a question that I do not often hear people in law enforcement ask. Can we try to understand what we are doing, and can we work to make it better? And can we use the technology that is now available, whether that's data or other forms of technology, to try to make our systems more just and fair? So I want to tell you how I came to tackle this problem, because this was not how I initially thought my career would start off. As a law student, I was a young idealist, and I wanted to go out and to try to fix the broken world. I grew up in a family that were social justice advocates who instilled in me at a young age that the world is broken and that we have an obligation to try to do something about it to fix it. And for me, the thing I wanted to try to work on were places that had been destroyed by war and conflict. I spent the early part of my career at the State Department, and I worked in places like Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina that were trying to rebuild after destructive wars. And I believed fundamentally that developing the rule of law and better law enforcement might be part of it. But one day I was in Kosovo speaking with one of my colleagues and said, if you really want to tackle the system, if you really want to begin to understand how systems work, you need to go be in the system first. You should go be a prosecutor. Now, I always viewed myself as a civil rights guy, and I couldn't imagine a job where incarceration would be part of my daily tasks. And I told him I care too much about civil rights. And my colleague said to me, if you really care about civil rights, then you need to go be a prosecutor, because they're the ones with the power in the system that can begin to make things different. So I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., where I began handling domestic violence and sex crimes cases. And it quickly became clear to me just how broken much of our system was. It was clear that many of the people who were entering our courtrooms and courthouses every day lived on the margins of society. They were low income. People were suffering from poverty. They were suffering from mental health challenges. They were suffering from issues of substance abuse disorder. And the solutions that we were providing most of the people who were entering was only incarceration. At the same time, I knew I was good at the job, and I wanted to keep using that power to try to do good on behalf of people whose rights were not were being violated. And one of the ways where I thought I could contribute the most was by investigating and prosecuting law enforcement officers who violated the law. I went to Department of Justice and ultimately got the case that would change the trajectory of my career. It was the murder of a man named Henry Glover, and it is the subject of the book that I've recently written. In 2005, in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the body of a man was found burned behind a levee in New Orleans. And for years, people did not know what happened to the man. A number of years later, an investigative journalist suggested for the first time that perhaps the police may have been involved in what happened to Henry Glover. At the time, I was a rookie prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and I went down to New Orleans to team up with a rookie FBI agent to try to look into the allegations and see whether or not the police had been involved at all. And during the course of that investigation, we found that not only had the police been involved, but a police officer had been responsible for shooting Henry Glover and killing him. Other police officers had been involved in the burning of Henry Glover's body afterwards. And then even more police officers were involved in the cover-up that followed in the years to follow. I'm not going to tell you all the ins and outs of the case. You can buy the book, and I hope you will. When I wrote it, I tried to write it in such a way that for people who care about investigating police misconduct, for people who care about holding police accountable, a way to understand how you can go about building a case. This was a case where we faced obstruction at all levels. We faced a number of officers who saw horrific things and then kept silent or lied about it. And it's a story about how me and my FBI agent partner and ultimately my U.S. Attorney's Office partner worked together to secure the indictments and the charges of this case. And ultimately, how this particular case, along with others that took place in New Orleans, caused more serious long-term changes in the structure of how they police and how they approach policing in their communities. And so this kind of thinking and seeing civil rights cases all across the country and watching how different communities handled them, and particularly how particular communities wanted to change the structures that had given rise to civil rights abuses in the first place, was always something that had fascinated me. So when Solicitor Scarlett Wilson came to me and began asking me, are we being fair? Can we begin to think about our data and our structures such that our system can produce more and fair results? I said, I want to go on and take it. This is really the first key, I think, in what it takes to make real change in communities, is defining what value is going to drive the process in your community. With Solicitor Wilson, it was about fairness. At one point, we were even discussing my goals, which were partly to reduce incarceration. I think that as a country, we spend too much incarceration in communities. It's expensive, and it often leads to terrible results. But what she said to me was, my focus is on fairness. And I think that if we can improve the access and fairness of the justice in our jurisdiction, we're going to reduce incarceration. So defining your values and deciding what you care and how you want to approach. Because ultimately, what we need is a different way of thinking, particularly what a data-informed way of thinking does, is allows us to measure whether or not we're achieving our values. But it is clear, and it's a step that oftentimes people miss, is defining those values in the first place. So I decided I wanted to go help Solicitor Wilson solve these problems, but there was one problem. I didn't know anything about data. I had read the book Moneyball, and for those of you who have read it, know that it's a book about a American League baseball team, the Oakland A's, who begins to use data analytics to win baseball games. And I remember thinking, if the Oakland A's can use data to achieve better outcomes for their sports team, perhaps we can also use data in the same way to improve outcomes for the communities that we care about. But I had to go and learn a little bit something about data. And what I've come to learn over the years is that the two most important things to know at the end of the day, well, number one, data is about counting. But it only can work if we rely on the underlying information, if we can rely on the numbers for which we are going to count. And number two, we need to make sure that we are counting what matters. Early in my career at the State Department, I worked on rebuilding justice systems in Iraq after the war there. And one of the goals that we were trying to do, one of the values that we were trying to achieve, was improving the rule of law in Iraq. And the metric that people had chosen to use to determine whether or not we were achieving that thing was the number of courthouses built. Now, if you think about that for a second, I think we can all agree that the number of courthouses that one builds does not mean that we are achieving justice or we are achieving the rule of law. In the criminal justice system, we've historically only counted two things. We've counted crime rates and we've counted who's been arrested. We count convictions and we look at sentence lengths. And those things tell us a little bit about how we're doing. But historically, it's been really hard to count. We haven't counted things connected to whether or not we're being effective. We haven't counted things about whether or not we're being fair. And we've not been counting basic things about whether or not we're being efficient. If we look at what we are hoping our justice system to be, if we desire it to be one that improves public safety, if we're building a system that points more towards justice, we want to make we want to make sure that we're counting the right things. So for those of you who are following in the chat right now, pop a list in there of the things that you wanted to count. If your prosecutor, if your police department, if your court system, if someone came to you and they said, what should we count to figure out if we're being fair? What would you want to count? Because ultimately, there's a whole lot of things we could count. I mean, we could count how people feel the system is serving them. I know we often joke that we give stars to pretty much everything. What if we did that for our justice system and we asked community members what they thought we were doing well or not? We could turn to victims and ask them how they feel about the services our system is currently providing. What we know is that about 60% of people who are victimized by violent crimes do not even bring their cases to the police or to law enforcement. They're opting out of the solution that we had. What if we took their voices into account when we're trying to design a better system? What if we made sure that we were counting the things that we cared the most about? Things like homicides and sexual assaults. As I travel around the country and talk to a lot of different places, people care about combating violence, about carjackings, about the rash of auto thefts that are taking place in their communities. But the reality is we are not solving the cases that matter most and give us the greatest sense of well-being and safety. And partly that's because of misprioritization of resources. So what if we began to count and think about some of these things a little bit different? And what if we really cared about keeping people out of our system, that the goal was to truly rehabilitate folks and make sure that the underlying problems, whether that be addiction or mental health or trauma, whether or not that gets addressed in a better way such that they're not re-entering our system and our service, our system anymore. One of the things that I want to count in a jurisdiction is how many years are they sentencing people to every year. One of the things that I think really matters is understanding what is the cost of our current system? What is the cost of the status quo? In one jurisdiction, we looked at the number of years they were incarcerating people for every year. That means on any given year, if you took all of the people who got sentenced for a crime, everything from 1 day sentence, 1 week sentence, all the way up to people who got 50 years. In this one jurisdiction of about 600,000 people, we're sentencing people to 4,000 years per year. I mean, if you think about that just from the sheer magnitude of the human suffering involved, that number means a lot. Certainly, there may be some role for incarceration in terms of making our communities safe. But there is a lot of incarceration in our system that does not need to be there. And it comes at a really steep cost. This is just one small jurisdiction. Those future years of incarceration costing about $136 million. Now, this is money that can easily go to address underlying causes of crime, whether it be helping serve the communities involving improved education systems, improved health situations, or even support to people who've suffered serious trauma. In Charleston, one of the things that we did was to help them understand what was in their system. Where were they spending their time and where were they spending their resources? We asked them to rank what their priorities are, where they thought they should be spending their time, and to try to understand how much of the years of incarceration that they were facing was coming from different types of crime. And as you can see over here, murder was their top priority, and the people who were sentenced got sentenced to a decent amount of time. But what they also saw was a number of the low-level offenses, the ones that they said they cared the least about, that they thought should be the lowest priorities of law enforcement, actually resulted in significant amount of incarceration. One of the other things that they realized that in these cases, particularly the lower level cases, the cases that are really the bread and butter of how much of policing in the community happens, they were finding that 1 in 4 of those cases were being dismissed in their entirety for things like insufficient evidence. These were decisions that prosecutors were making that helped them understand, these cases should not be in the system. And when we dug down into those numbers, we noticed a number of things. Number one, there were a lot of people who did not need to be in the system. And number two, it was often taking hundreds of days to get people out. And number three, that there was often a real racial disparity in terms of how long it was taking for people to go through that system. And as we began to look at it and to try to understand what was happening, what we realized is there was a real disparities in terms of the cases that were coming in. Black individuals in the Charleston area were 5 times more likely to be arrested, 6 times more likely if you're only circling in on the enforcement of drug laws. And if you're looking at people under the age of 30, you see even greater racial disparities. Now, when the jurisdiction began to see those numbers, they also recognized that this was inconsistent with their values of fairness, and they wanted to do something different. And so if we're going to begin to fix the world, one of the things that we have to make sure that we're doing is counting the right things. So if you think about what you care about in your communities in terms of your enforcement efforts, and particularly as there is increasing amounts of data available, think through what values should drive your decisions and what are the things that you can count to make sure that you're achieving those values. Now, when the office found out that these numbers were inconsistent with what they hoped for from a public safety perspective, from a fairness perspective, from a smart use of government resources perspective, they wanted to do something about it. But the problem was they didn't really begin to know, how do you tackle a problem like this? So often when we think of problems, we look to the individual actors and whether or not they have good or bad intent. But when we're talking about a system problem, a problem that is functioning as multiple entities and elements that are often interacting, how do we begin to try to fix that problem? One of the things that I have learned to turn to is systems thinking, which is a scientific study of systems and how they work. And I think it poses, we often see it in engineering, we often see this kind of thinking in buildings and constructions. So what if we use that same kind of approach when we're thinking about the justice system and how it functions? So I want to start with some basic definitional parts, and then we'll get into how they try to fix their problem. So a system is an interconnected set of elements organized to achieve a purpose. And if you think that is a broad definition, it is. Virtually anything can be a system. That means the police departments that we are part of are their own systems. Our families are systems. Our full justice system is a system. What I like about systems thinking, recognizing its broad definition, is that any system that we are a part of, any team that we are a part of, any group that we are a part of, we can begin to use this approach to try to figure out how can we change our behavior in such a ways that we are more likely to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. So some of the big takeaways and why I think systems thinking is so powerful. A system is not the sum of its part, it's the product of its interactions. And so when we better understand how different components of a system interact, we're going to find that we can get the most bang for our buck in terms of improvement. So if we think of our current system as it is set up, what do we think it's trying to achieve? How would we define our purpose? I would argue that it isn't to obtain justice. Our system wasn't designed to achieve justice. And I would also argue that our system wasn't even set up to achieve public safety. Our system was set up to achieve punishment. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that we should never confuse punishment for justice, and we certainly should not confuse punishment for community safety. And so when we think about what purpose we want our system to achieve, it should be grounded in the values, it should be shaped by those numbers. And we know that in order to fix it, we're going to have to think about its component parts, because there's a saying in the systems thinking world that our systems are perfectly designed to achieve the results they're currently achieving. So if we're looking at a part of our system and we want to address things like disparities in how people are treated, or we want to change the way that our law enforcement is using its public safety resources, that we begin to think about different kind of results, well, it means that we got to tinker with the system. And so what is systems thinking? Systems thinking is understanding the interactions between different parts of a system so that we can achieve the outcomes that we really want. Now, why do I like this stuff so much? What I think is interesting about systems thinking is it allows us to tell the story of what is happening in our communities in a way that can ratchet down some of the venom that we typically get when we're talking about things like justice reform. And it gets us a little bit closer to actually begin to solving some of the problems. One of the things systems thinking does is help people understand the role that each of us as individuals and the roles that we play in this process contribute to exacerbating underlying problems. Most people want to believe that they're doing their best and that other people are responsible for the problems. But what systems thinking allows us to do is to understand how things like our own incentives or the own structures that are at play can contribute to these outcomes. And when we better link between component parts, that's when you have the ability to really make a systemic shift in what happens. So let me give you an example. For anyone out there who has ever used a bathtub, I think this would be a familiar picture. We're trying to figure out how a bathtub functions. And in the classic example, you've got one thing that turns on the hot, one thing that turns on the cold. So you fill up the bathtub. If you're trying to have a perfect bath, you want to mess with the temperature so you get a little bit of hot, a little bit cold, and then you get to the right level. But what we know, and what I think one of the ways that we have used this thinking is to help communities deal with backlogs of cases that are currently in their system, things that are slowing down the effective public safety functioning, but also leaving a lot of people trapped in a system that's leading them to less good results. So what if we think about our current court system much like a bathtub, and we think about what's coming in, and we know that there are a lot of cases that are coming in that are simply bad cases. About 1 in 4 of those cases were being dismissed because they were bad cases. They should not have been in the system. And as a result, people were getting stuck because with the COVID lockdown, people got trapped in the system. And what we know began to happen was that it looked a little bit about like this. Our court systems are overflowing with cases, with people who don't need to be there, and who are taking a lot of resources away from things that we want to prioritize in our community. So using this process, the office began to think about, well, what levers do we have? Where can we begin? Where can we begin? Well, where can we begin to change things so that we can make a difference? And so one of the things they decided they wanted to do, they wanted to review and figure out, are there ways that we can identify these bad cases earlier in the process? Two of the things that we always want to look for in any particular system is understanding what are the bottlenecks, what are the things that are slowing down progress, what are the things that are getting in the way of being able to have what we want happen, and what are the feedback loops? How do the different parts of the system interact with each other? And are they feeding them information in a way that can make our system perform better so that we are more likely to get the outcomes that we want? What this office decided to do was to put a screener earlier in the process. We looked at how a case got in their system. We looked at why a case was being assigned in a particular way, and it got passed around from prosecutor to prosecutor, which meant that no one was really reviewing a case oftentimes for 60 days or 70 days. And so what the office decided to do was just put someone earlier in the process whose job was to find cases that should not be in the system and get rid of them. And if you can see what happened once they did that, they began identifying more cases earlier that would have otherwise been stuck in the system and most likely would have probably wound up in a guilty plea and probably further incarceration. But this was a way to identify even more cases, get them out of the system. And the impact that it had on the communities involved, particularly, they were identifying a lot of cases where Black defendants had been arrested on worse evidence and get those cases out of the system much faster in the system, much faster in the process. What we are seeing, because we've now expanded this process to include every police department in this jurisdiction, and we've set it up as a randomized control trial, which is the gold standard in how one evaluates the success of the program. And what we've seen is they've been able to reduce the number of days it takes to resolve a case from 220 down to closer to 30. So saving about 190 days of time stuck in the system. And what we see is that when you do that, when you get people out of the system faster, we're showing much lower rates of rearrest, because being in the system for any period of time, we know can be detrimental. But what this has also allowed this office to do is to give immediate feedback back to police officers and explaining why their conduct might have been unconstitutional or ineffective or inappropriate, to step back from 50,000 feet and to be able to understand the policies and the procedures and the way these different component parts interact. And we've seen strong evidence that we can reduce the number of cases in the system, as well as reduce the backlog in the system. One of the things that most jurisdictions across America are suffering with is a massive backlog, because people kept getting arrested during the system, oftentimes for low-level offenses, and they're stuck in the system, but the cases aren't being processed fast enough. And so before we began working in Charleston, before we had this screening process, you can see at the bottom of this, every month, basically from January 2016 until early 2021, more cases were coming in the system than were going out of the system. They were continuously bringing in these low-level offenses, and they also weren't prosecuting them. They weren't processing. What this new process allowed them to do was to set new community priorities in terms of where the focus of the team should be, get those weak cases out of the system. And as you can see over the subsequent years, they are now literally shrinking the footprint of their system, making it smaller. And how is that translated into things that we care about? It means that they've reduced incarceration by about 1,000 years per year. Every year that they continue to do that, that is incarceration that is not taking place, and it's future savings of about $64 million. Now, this is just one small intervention that has taken place. But what I think it begins to show is that when we figure out what we care about, when we make sure that we're counting the right things, and then we can deconstruct the system to understand how are the different actors interacting, what are the components that are most contributing to outcomes, what are default decisions in systems that make it more likely that one outcome will occur, where are these feedback loops that are creating outcomes that are inconsistent with what you care about. And the fourth and final step to what I think it will take to fix the world, and where I think we have spent a lot of time, is to meet people where they're at. We work with jurisdictions across America. We work in Republican-led jurisdictions, Democratic-led jurisdictions. We work in the North, we work in the South, and we work with people who are tackling all sorts of different problems. But every time we walk into a new jurisdiction, we recognize that we are outsiders. We don't know this place. We don't know its concerns. We don't know its values. And so we start by listening to people, to the people who are impacted the most by that system. That includes people in law enforcement, the police officers, the prosecutors, the people who are been incarcerated, people who are victims of crime, people who are interacting with their law enforcement every day. And we try to understand what it is that they care about, what it is they want to count, and figure out the ways that we can begin to move things forward. The approach has been called a common sense, we can't believe this isn't already being done program. We believe that this kind of approach is inclusive. It can bring both community members and law enforcement together. And where we have seen it make a lot of success is in changing police practices. One of the places where we helped in office was St. Paul, Minnesota, where they were putting in a new process to reduce the use of pretextual stops. Walter Scott, who I was telling you about at the top of the hour, was engaging with the police officer because he'd been pulled over for a broken taillight. Now, many of you, I'm sure, know a lot of the information that's available on there, that it can be incredibly deadly. I think 800 or so people have been killed in traffic stops over the last few years. And we know as a form of public safety, it is incredibly ineffective at addressing what it claims to do, which is to try to reduce violence. What they did in St. Paul, Minnesota, was to try to stop that policy and to measure whether or not it was achieving its goals. And they found they could stop using non-public traffic stops and begin to shift those resources to other things. What we hope to do in communities is to figure out where can we solve problems right now and reduce the harm that a lot of communities are facing. Our philosophy at Justice Innovation Lab is to start by understanding the world as it is, imagine it as it could be, and then to do something about it and to take practical steps. But what does that mean? As you look around your communities and you look around at the problems that you want to start to take on, make sure that the people that you are talking about on these big plans, like that you have a shared sense of value. Why is it that you're doing it? What is it that you care about? And what is it that you hope to achieve? Make sure that you and your leaders are counting the right things. Make sure that we can measure what really counts. Because at the end of the day, when we're trying to tackle solutions, we always say that we come at this with a hypothesis mindset. We have ideas of what we think could work to fix it, but we also have an obligation to make sure that we're not making things worse. If you look at the history of reform, many times when we've tried to change the system, we've made many of the underlying problems worse. Map out the system, figure out where are the bottlenecks, where the default settings are, where the incentives are in your system so that you can begin to figure out the levers where you can make the biggest difference in figuring out outcomes. And when you engage with people across the spectrum, meet them where they're at. Try to understand where they are coming from and try to figure out the ways where your values may be aligned, because where we find that values alignment is where we're going to be able to make the biggest difference. If you're interested in learning more about Justice Innovation Lab, we have a presence on various different social media. We've got a website that you can check out to learn more about us. If you're interested in learning more about how to investigate police misconduct, and from my experience of 14 years investigating, prosecuting police cases, please check out Fire on the Levee. And finally, I really believe that this is a movement of people who are trying to figure out, how do we solve these problems? We have to begin taking action right now. I think what the last few years has made it clear is just how broken our justice system is. And our hope is that we can begin to help more and more communities tackle their problems. And so if you have ideas of where you think we can go next, which problems we should take on, which communities are ready to come forward and solve some of these problems, we're really excited to try to help.
Thank you so much, Jared. As someone who appreciates visuals and the bicycle and the bathtub analogies was really interesting to me, the way you explained systems thinking using those. We've got a couple of questions, and they're actually, earlier you had asked people to enter something in the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have the chat turned on, but people did enter some comments about some things that they might measure in response to that question. So those comments from Christopher and Anthony are in reference to when you were discussing that. One of the questions that we have, I will read it for you. What explains the divergent outcomes for dismissal recommendations among Black and white males when screening occurs? Were Black males more likely to be booked for petty offenses?
Yes. So, I mean, a lot of those cases were for the lowest level of cases. A lot of them came out of pretextual traffic stops, more likely to be stopped in one of those stops that we're talking about. And particularly, there's a practice where someone is stopped and there's some contraband found in the car, the practice of just arresting everyone in the car, even though there's insufficient evidence to prosecute those folks. So those were some of the trends that we began to see. And just lower quality of cases. I think anytime you see a police department expanding its reach, and typically the way the rationale will go is they're trying to solve violent crime. So they go to a neighborhood where there may be more violence. But part of what they are doing is they're using these other techniques like stopping any traffic, stopping any car, stop and frisk, or just merely maintaining their presence in places where they see more activity for which they could arrest. And so when that is the approach, you just bring in a lot lower quality cases. That's not how you solve homicides. That's not how you solve non-fatal shootings, which for most people are what they want the police spending their resources on. In terms of the question that I see about other talking about resisting arrest and talking back to an officer, I mean, absolutely, we see that over and over again. And I think screening can surely play a check. Now, part of it comes down to getting people to understand what is happening in their system. And I think as we see more in those, prosecutors are going to be a key component of holding police officers accountable. In fact, I think they are the best positioned people to really make a huge difference. I know there's a lot of folks who think, well, the prosecutors work hand in hand with the police departments, and that may be true in your jurisdiction. That I've certainly seen that happen in many jurisdictions. But in other places, I've seen real opportunities where the police and the prosecutors can actually come together. And when we see things like people getting arrested for disorderly, there is a real role that we can play and having the prosecutor say, no, we're not doing these cases. Stop bringing them in, and we're going to screen them and remove them fast in our system. And I think we're beginning to see that in places. I also see a few people putting comments into as to things they would want to count. Right now, I don't know that you can get a good count in any jurisdiction about how many cases got suppressed evidence. That would be a hard number to count right now, but it's certainly something we could do and should do to understand and identify trends in policing. And I think looking at things about upcharging, downcharging in systems and what that says about the original arrests, absolutely. Those are things that we can check to figure out whether or not the system is working.
Elsa has a comment and question. What's the most effective way to convince our sheriff and board of supervisors how valuable having everyone in the same room at the same time to find shared values is? Is that when we bring you in this presentation?
Sure. I mean, we've worked with a lot of different places. I think the key is finding out who are the people where there already is some degree of alignment. Figuring out where do you have allies right now in those offices and begin to have conversations with them. One of the first things I always do when trying to figure out where your shared values, because much of the time when I talk to communities across the country, they want two things. They want to live in safe communities and they want their government to be fair and not wasteful and actually fixing some of these problems. That is generally, I find that people have that shared agreement. And so then it's about figuring out, well, what are the different ways that we see that unfairness play out? So in your community, maybe it's about traffic stops. In your community, maybe it's about the enforcement of low-level offenses. Trying to figure out where you think those spaces where there's inconsistency with what law enforcement says it's trying to do. I think one of the areas where I see a lot of room at the moment is in non-fatal shootings and in carjackings. I think this is a problem that a lot of communities across the country want to face, but they're not being solved. There isn't cooperation, and partly that is because of the approach that a lot of police departments have taken. And so if you're in a community where you think there may be an opening to think differently about a problem, traffic stops, non-fatal shootings, the auto theft, those tend to be really good places to figure out where are your allies and how can you come together to try to find a solution to that problem that is generally recognized as a problem. We are always happy to go speak to departments that may be interested. We're always looking for new jurisdictions that might be good fits for future work. So
Yeah, in the follow-up email that I'll send everyone who's registered for this, I'll include your contact information for Justice Innovation Lab. So everyone has that.
So do I think that moving charging decisions from police officers to prosecutors reduces the length of time before a case is dismissed? It can, for certain. I think when you have a check very early in the process on an underlying arrest, then yeah, it can get the case out of the system the night of the arrest. When I was in Washington, D.C., we reviewed cases that night within 24 hours. And if a case wasn't valid, it was dismissed immediately. That is a pretty rare process in most communities. Certainly in the Southeast, where the tradition is the police make those initial charging decisions, and there's very little checking early in the process. I think that is true throughout much of the Midwest as well. Tend to see it less on the coasts, but most places do not have processes set up to deal with the sheer volume of cases that are now entering the system. And so, the system was not set up to be our mental health processing system. Like, it was not set up to help people who are suffering from substance abuse issues get treatment they need. No, it was set up to punish people for breaking the law. And part of what the war on drugs and the change in how we police has been to increase the number of people coming in substantially, for petty things, for low level things, and remarkably for fewer and fewer of the things that we think the system should be doing, like the homicides and in sex offenses, for example. Someone asked about jail deaths increasing in the area. How do you use data to fix it? I mean, I have always wanted to dive into the death data and try to understand where is it coming from, in terms of, are we seeing repeated patterns in what is leading to those deaths? I think for a state, I wanted to use it as an investigator to figure out where we should start looking. Were there certain jails or prisons that were having particularly high death and custody rates? I mean, one of the things that I think is particularly, and I would like to see this happening more in custody deaths case, are treating it more like a plane crash. Using a systems thinking approach. For those of you who've never investigated a plane crash, oftentimes what we're doing is trying to understand every step of the decision-making process that ultimately led to the bad decision. Because it's not usually like one guy had a bad decision and then the whole plane went down. It's compounding sets of systems. I looked into this one in custody death in a jail once, and it was terrible at so many different steps in the process. And the officers ultimately used unnecessary force. But what I found so problematic were all of the really bad decisions that led up to that use of force in the first place. And those are things where I think we can begin to tackle some of those process. In terms of accepted data on police murder per year, the Washington Post is the best source right now of that data. They collect data. I think their current number was about 1,200 per year. And that is, I think, a really big start. Most states have no reporting requirements. Police departments don't require, and so that's why the Washington Post is currently one of the best sources. Hey, Uncle Bobby, how you doing? Yeah, what data can be reviewed? You're not going to find that many. The reality is very few of these cases get prosecuted. I don't know if the Justice Department puts out numbers on how, I think they probably put out numbers on how many people get charged in a given year. I think one of the things that's challenging about even looking at that data is that the police officers tend not to get charged in the year that the death took place. So if the killing takes place in 2023, it is unlikely you're going to see any prosecution for at least a year, oftentimes multiple years. So those numbers can be a bit misleading. But even in for the years 2005 to 2020, I think there were something like 40 officers successfully prosecuted for murder or manslaughter. And during those same 15 years, probably 15,000 people were killed in interactions with the police. So it pales in comparison. And I think that's why as a prosecutor, I was always so frustrated was that even when I won a singular case, you know that there's hundreds, if not thousands of other cases that you cannot effectively investigate. And that's part of why I feel much more bullish about trying to tackle some of these systems because if we can get the police to having fewer of these car stops, for example, well, then there's going to be fewer opportunities for them to turn deadly. If we can change the interactions that are taking place on the enforcement of low-level drug offenses and rethink about how we're tackling things like addiction and mental health, then there are going to be fewer opportunities for people to be engaged. One of the interesting things I think we're seeing, and I think in terms of one of the positive potential features of artificial intelligence in this space is now there's more body camera and more footage of interactions than we've ever had before. And there are people who are beginning to study what are the things that we know. It makes it more likely that a traffic stop will lead to a use of force. And one of the things that we know is the language that an officer uses when they initially engage with the car and whether or not it's, I guess, more pleasant or more aggressive changes the likelihood that it's going to use up in force. And not surprisingly, when these interactions start off more aggressively, it's more likely to turn out in force. And so there are police departments who are recognizing this because for many of them, it is in their interest not to have lawsuits against civilians, not to have their police officers using unnecessary force, to come up with more effective engagement, because there's a recognition that when we engage with civilians in these traffic stops, I mean, if you're finding contraband 1% of the time, that means 99% of the time, you're just stopping a civilian. And those are the people that we need in cooperation to tackle these bigger processes. The Sentinel process, yeah, I think we see a number of police departments that are trying it. To me, I think this is like if I had a community that was open to this kind of idea, I think this is something that I would be promoting a lot. Every time there's a death, we often turn to the criminal prosecution. That's one of the first things that as communities we call for. Get the prosecutor out there. Let's investigate. Let's prosecute the officer. And as we know, that happens very rarely. Um, but that shouldn't be our only demand. What we should be demanding is that we review the process. Now, I investigated the Tamir Rice killing, and I can't say much about it, but one of the things that I can say is that case went wrong from the dispatch. Like immediately from the point that someone called 911 and dispatch began sending people to the scene. Now, I don't know whether or not anyone has fixed that problem in Cleveland, but it's certainly, if you want to stop events like the killing of Tamir Rice, then you also have to be addressing those particular processes. And oftentimes we don't even know what it is. And I looked at one in South Carolina where there's a man who died. He had brought himself to a mental health institution because he was melting down. Fast forward a few hours later and he's dead. And if you look at what happened every step of the way, there was a system failure. And these are the kind of things that we can fix. And they're the things that we can fix, particularly in the wake of a tragedy. part of the reason why St. Paul, Minnesota decided to take on traffic stops was the death of Philando Castile. Like people saw that death and they said, no, this should not be how our law enforcement is interacting. And with some really great leadership in St. Paul, they're beginning to tackle that.
Just curious, do you ever encounter resistance when you come into a community to help them?
All the time. I mean, you know, all the time. I think people are afraid of change, and they're particularly afraid of change when we talk about, I don't know, overthrowing the status quo. That is very scary for people. But the reality is the places where we can make the greatest impact right now is on the inside. And so I think there is often this challenge from I've always viewed myself as an outsider who gets to operate on the inside. Throughout my career as a civil rights lawyer, I always went down to a jurisdiction that was not my home. I always investigated people who were not my law enforcement, but I also had tools of the federal government that allowed me to have subpoena power, allowed me to put people in grand jury. That was a lot. That was allowed me to be on the inside, even though I was on the outside. And I think the challenge, I think, for a lot of law enforcement oversights is you're also sort of a little bit on you're the outside, but you also have access to the inside. And so thinking about what that access looks like and where you have the opportunity to ask for different data or to ask for different meetings or to raise and highlight different issues and keep your folks accountable. I mean, ask for basic things. Like I just think it is crazy to me that in most cities in America, you cannot find out how many people were arrested last year. Right? That's a pretty basic thing that we should be counting. I mean, I saw one statistic the other day, it costs $3,000 every time we arrest someone. Forget about what happens next. Just the process of arresting someone, taking them down to the station, booking them, going about $3,000. And particularly if we're seeing things like, mental health cases, like we could definitely utilize our resources more effectively.
The final question, which you actually kind of started addressing, this will be the final question and then we'll wrap up.
What advice do I have for independent citizen-led police oversight commissions? I mean, I have come to believe that the key is finding out who your allies are on the inside. Who are the people who speak the language of data? There's usually at least one guy in the police department, maybe two. One of the things that I often say is like, look at what's working right. Who are the people who can get stuff done in the police department and try to figure out where they think there are opportunities and target your interventions over the opportunities that exist right now. It may not be the biggest thing. It may not be your biggest problem, but what we found out is even just reviewing cases to see whether or not they should be dismissed had a huge impact on incarceration. Like that wasn't the goal. The goal was to be more fair. The goal was to cut off the bad cases, but because we were intervening sooner, we had these bigger downstream effects. Figure out where that in is. Figure out how to talk their language. Way often as advocates, I mean, I learned this as a civil rights lawyer, like you can't do a civil rights case in the deep South and come in and only talk about rights and fairness. Like that's not where you're going to win over the people if you need 12 people, that's not how you're going to do it. You have to understand what are the things they care about in terms of, stability. People care about stability. People care about particular crimes. People care about knowing that there is order and that the rules are going to be followed in a particular way. Well, then speak that language to the people that you need to win on board, because we can reframe the things we care about so that they're consistent with the things that they care about. What I find when I travel around the country is I think 70 to 80% of people in this country agree on most of the issues that I talk about. They're not terribly radical. but they're also not often the conversations that we're having. And so I think just even thinking differently about how we talk about things, instead of talking about data, like talk about what are we going to count? Talk about, all right, well, let's like deconstruct how this decision gets made. Let's figure out where things are being slowed down right now. And that often becomes a window to having a deeper conversation.
And I'll just add on to that for Sue's question, whether you're a board, a commission, or auditor, or monitor, if you have the ability to provide recommendations as a part of an oversight entity, whether you're reviewing policies and procedures or monitoring and auditing what's going on in the law enforcement agency or jail and prison, then there's an opportunity there to affect policy and procedure, and also make requests for specific types of information or data that you would like to receive from the law enforcement agencies. Okay, our time is up, and so we are going to wrap things up. Jared, thank you so much for taking the time to do this webinar with us today and to share your expertise in this area. We really could not do what we do at NACOLE without people like you who are willing to share your time and your expertise. Thank you to the NACOLE Training, Education, and Standards Committee for ensuring that we always have a robust webinar series. And then thank you all for attending today, taking the time and continuing to support our webinars and other events. Couple of announcements. Our next webinar is May the 14th, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Investigating Police Surveillance Technology. Registration is open, and there's more information, detail about the webinar on our website. And then our registration should open in the mid-May for our 30th annual conference this year, which is taking place in Tucson, Arizona. For those of you who might want to nominate somebody for one of our awards that are awarded at the annual conference, the Flame Award and the Achievement or Contributions to Oversight Award, please start thinking about people, organizations, anybody who might be someone that you would nominate for those awards, because we will be opening that up soon as well. Thank you for being with us today, everybody, and we look forward to the next event. Have a great day.